because there's finally some peer-reviewed stuff coming out, and there's recently been quite a few peer-reviewed and randomized clinical trials done on ivermectin that have come out very positive as a treatment. That's the name that cannot be mentioned, kind of like hydroxychloroquine was. You can't talk about these treatments because all we can talk about is the vaccine. We can't talk about treatments. We've got to talk about social distancing. Don't forget to wash your hands. You can't ever take off your mask. But now I pulled out something, and this is just a prospectus. This is like an op-ed almost out of the New England Journal of Medicine from May 21st of 2020 called Universal Masking in Hospitals in the COVID-19 Area. And I just wanted to read a couple of quotes from it. It says, "We know that wearing a mask outside healthcare facilities offers little, if any, protection from infection." But then the most interesting part of this, I think, is toward the end of this little op-ed. And it says, "It's also clear that masks serve symbolic roles. Masks are not only tools, they are also talismans that may help increase healthcare workers' perceived sense of safety, well-being, and trust in their hospitals. Although such reactions may not be strictly logical, we are all subject to fear and anxiety, especially during times of crisis. One might argue that fear and anxiety are better countered with data and education than with a marginally beneficial mask, particularly in light of the worldwide mask shortage. But it is difficult to get clinicians to hear this message in the heat of the current crisis. Expanded masking protocols' greatest contributions may be to reduce the transmission of anxiety." This is in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it tells you masking doesn't work, but these are talismans. I can't believe the language they're using, like it's some kind of magical device. It's a talisman to scare away anxiety. I'll leave this with you, Roxanne, if you want to peruse it.
I want to look into this
That's
more.
May 2020. It's the best thing is that it scares away anxiety. That's what the mask does. It scares away your anxiety. I mean, isn't that crazy? Now we have something, now with actual data, over a year now, we have actual data, and this came out in the journal called Medical Hypotheses. This came out just recently, and it says face masks in the COVID-19 era, a health hypothesis. And by the way, this concludes that prolonged and continuous effect of wearing face masks is maladaptive and could be detrimental for health. In addition to hypoxia and hypercapnia, breathing through face masks residues bacterial and germ components on the inner and outside layer of the face mask. These toxic components are repeatedly rebreathed back into the body, causing self-contamination. And it goes on to say that the long-term practice of wearing face masks has a strong potential for devastating health consequences. And at the same time, we're being told we're never going to be allowed to take off these masks.
Back on the Morgan Streetman Show. Morgan, we've just kind of like scratched the surface, literally, of all the surface here. You still have a stack of papers on.
Well, I had those studies we didn't even really get to go through all the quotes I wanted to read on those studies, but I'm kind of rushing through. But I've had those for a couple of weeks now that I wanted to highlight for folks. And then some big news last week when Tucker Carlson on his show finally talked about a story that we actually haven't had a chance to cover, but appears to be a growing story, and that's all the people that are dying and having other adverse reactions to coronavirus vaccines, and it's no small number. Just to give you some context, every flu season, about 160 million Americans get the flu shot, right? So in 2019, about 160 million people got the flu vaccine, and about 200 people died from it. Those are the numbers. So it's very safe, right? 160 million, 200 people dying. Now, with respect to the coronavirus vaccine, we've already clocked over 3,700 deaths just this year from people getting the coronavirus vaccine. So that's a significant amount more deaths. And the thing is, we're relying on this federal database called the VAERS system, Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. And the federal government's own studies show, and this came out of the Department of Health and Human Services in 2010, that, quote, fewer than 1% of vaccine adverse events are reported. So if that's the case, and only 1% have been reported, and we've got about 4,000 deaths so far, what do? You multiply that number by 100, right? That gives you the number 400,000. Now, we're not saying 400,000 people have died from the coronavirus vaccine, but clearly it is more dangerous than getting the flu vaccine. There's something else afoot here. Another interesting fact is that coronavirus vaccines now account for about a third of all tinnitus reports in the VAERS database. That's that ringing you get in your ear that won't go away. Like if you went to a heavy metal concert when you were a teenager or something, sometimes you'd have that ringing for a week. Pat George, you probably know what I'm talking about there.
I had it this morning.
But what are all these adverse events coming from the vaccine? I mean, it is a giant medical experiment. And, of course, you're not allowed to say that. Thankfully, Tucker Carlson did last week. Got a couple other things. You got to go check out this about a 21-page report that was posted in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists by a guy named Nicholas Wade, who's quite a credentialed journalist. And he goes through the entire history of the coronavirus and where it came from and the most likely explanations for it. Highly scientific article. He gets into a lot of the details that even we haven't been able to get into on this show because it's difficult for folks to understand. And when you look at it, you got a 23-page report to explain it. And he's really only scratching the surface on the details. He's covering what he absolutely has to cover to help you understand it. But he's concluding the most likely explanation is this came out of a viral lab in Wuhan where they were working on this, where Peter Daszak and the EcoHealth Alliance, and remember that Professor Ralph Barrick from UNC, and they were working with the bat lady Xi Jinping when you weren't allowed to do it in the U.S. anymore, and they moved it over to Wuhan, and they started working on these gain-of-function research on coronaviruses built on a backbone, adding in spike proteins to make different kind of coronaviruses, and lo and behold, something like that gets out. And the detail really is pretty impressive. He goes through so many details scientifically that just cause you to conclude. I mean, you can't say for certain, but gosh, the evidence all points towards a release from that Wuhan Institute of Virology. So that's something worth going out and checking out there. That just came out last week. Also last week, there was a big news story talking about how the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, had a document in 2015 discussing how to weaponize SARS coronaviruses, which is exactly what COVID-19 is. And they were discussing how they could use those, how they could modify them, exactly what we're talking about, take a basic backbone like we've heard them talk about, add the spike protein, manipulate it into an emerging human disease virus, then weaponize it and unleash it. And so that story came out last week, which also makes you say, well, look, the Chinese were working on how to do this, and lo and behold, here it comes. And in the midst of all this, our last coronavirus story, and then we're going to get into our Out There segment if this isn't out there enough. But you remember that Canadian preacher from the Street Church in Calgary in Alberta, Canada? He's the one that the police came to his church one Sunday, and he was up in arms screaming at them. His name is Arthur Pawlowski. And he was saying, "Get out, Nazis! Get out, Nazis!" And I mean, he literally was screaming at the police, made him leave his church because they were there to try to intimidate people. They say you can't have church services amidst this pandemic that we've got going on. And so, well, guess what happened yesterday? Yesterday, on his way driving home from church, they arrested him, pulled him over on the highway, arrested him right next to traffic. I mean, cars whizzing by. And they're taking this guy down almost SWAT style, putting him in handcuffs and dragging him to the police car for the crime of, conducting an unlawful assembly. An unlawful assembly. In other words, they're soon going to be saying, and this is in Canada where they don't have freedom of religion, but we've seen similar efforts here in the United States where we are supposed to be protected. Our rights to free exercise of religion are supposed to be protected. And they arrested this guy. They already fined him previously. They arrested him and his brother for daring to conduct a church service during this pandemic environment. So go out there and check out Arthur Pawlowski and the latest on him if you're passionate about that particular cause.
That was a bad video.
It was a bad video. It's terrible.
Shocking. It's
terrible. And he came from communism. I think he came from Poland, and he talked about how, I lived through it. I saw what communism is about, and I don't believe in that here. And I'm standing up for freedom and individual liberty. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.